Okay, thank you very much for that. And thanks to all the speakers. What a range of talks that was. Lots of different things we could possibly talk about. We are standing between you and the pub. Right? So it's a very dangerous position to find ourselves in. But I'm sure we'll be very happy to answer any questions from the audience first. Yeah.
In terms of how do you manage the flow of information that comes from the crowd as they contribute to your open source project? Could you just comment on that?
Sure, it's one of the big time factors that you have to account for is managing contributions that come in across lots of different platforms. So many times people will email me, and then I have to negotiate how we put that information into the public domain, because people sometimes don't feel happy to put things on a public platform. And managing, so for example, a contributor just made some molecules recently and had this evaluated. Post the data to the lab notebook, but the data need to be incorporated into the ongoing project description on the wiki. So someone has to take the time to make sure they've got the right codes assigned and that the diagram is written and the data are put back into the original diagrams, and you incorporate the learnings and so on and so on. And that takes a lot of time. It takes more time than a regular project because the outward-facing nature of it has to be understandable by newcomers. So you have to keep your house in order pretty much, and that takes longer than for a private project where you can. I mean, it's like when you invite people around to your house, you've got to clean up, right? And it's the same with science. If you want people to look at it, it's got to be in good condition. So yes, that's the big time sink, and that falls on. If we're going to scale up what we're doing, we would need to have someone specifically managing the project full time, who isn't a scientist even, just managing the data and so on. Maybe, okay. Sorry, was there another question on that? If anyone else wants to contribute,
I have a question,
because it's an interesting question.
I have a question for you, actually, which
really?
is this is kind of the gorilla in the room, and in all the groups we talk about just say no to patents, and I'm interested that you stand so firmly on that. The other side of that I've heard is that, and this has come up at MMV a number of times, is that if you don't have a patent at the end of the day, what is the incentive, even for a small profit sort of situation, like transferring a compound over to an Indian pharmaceutical company or something that's expecting to get something reasonable, a return on investment of 3 to 5% or something like that. If there isn't a patent, they end up at risk for setting up manufacturing facilities, completing phase 3, going into phase 4, funding all that, and then potentially leading it by somebody coming in and undercutting them and not being able to recover those charges. So isn't there a role for patent at some point? Can't you play in the open source and then actually, when you get to your candidates, go ahead and patent them at that time?
So yeah, so there's a lot to talk about there, and it depends which disease you're talking about, and it depends, on lots of things. If you can't retrospectively patent. If you Google retrospective patent, you won't find anything except a blog post I wrote a few months ago. You can't do something and then retrospectively claim something for it. I wish you could, because that would make everything a lot simpler. I think that if you get a compound through clinical without any IP protection, the generics market will deal with it. So I know that Cipla, for example, would love an open source pharma industry, because anything that pops out of clinical, they will just deal with. They will manufacture it, distribute it without any IP protection. So I think that's a done deal. The issue is getting things through clinical. Then you've got to think about alternative financing mechanisms, and we could have a whole session on this about alternatives to the traditional way of funding clinical trials. And we heard some today, right? I mean, the European Clinical Trial Partnership that we just heard about is one possibility. But there are others. I mean, there are lots of financing mechanisms that are new for funding drug development. And we heard about priority review vouchers, and there are advanced market commitments, the Gavi, and so on. None of these methods have been combined with open source. That's the interesting thing, and I think that's the next thing we have to do, is work out which of these you could combine with a completely transparent research process. So, for example, you don't need a patent to get money back from a drug if you make use of data exclusivity. But no one has ever tried to take a born open, as far as I know, take a born open compound all the way to the market and then use data exclusivity as a way of getting money back. But that seems like a good experiment to run. Yeah. So I think it depends on lots of factors. If anyone else wants to chip in, or from the audience about this issue about trying to take something which is IP free into the market, it would be very interesting, because I think it's the key issue for open source.
Yes, you know, IP has always been a very challenging issue, and I mean, the whole concept of patenting is it's supposed to be an enabling technology to allow the inventor to develop that product through investment and so on in order to get a return on their investment. And the problem is, I think patents are misused in many cases. And academics in particular do not understand the importance or the merit or value of patenting molecules, and they tend to overvalue their assets when actually they're worth diddly squat. And all that happens is this is an obstacle to the development of new molecules. And Wes is absolutely right that if you want to engage with a pharmaceutical partner under the current situation, such that they get due recognition for the investment that they have made, then you do need patent protection. The issue, I think, is how great should that chemical space be? Is it so large that it excludes everyone else from working to make a better, second generation molecule? So that issue's been debated with the Drug Discovery Unit in relation to GSK. And our position is that we patent in the small chemical space around the molecules we intend to develop, but not so large as to exclude others who can come on and make a better molecule. So that's our position at the moment. I'd love it to be completely open source, but then you've got to find the right drivers to engage pharmaceutical partners for development. And ultimately, the big problem I think we run into a lot in these complex consortia is not giving appropriate attribution to all members of the consortium. And I try to emphasize that always in my acknowledgement slides. No one person discovers a drug. It's far more complicated than that. That's my view.
I fully agree, and I would add another incentive from the pharma when we're going to work in a field which we have renounced to the return, and is trying to push back people that can misuse your inventions. So you patent to protect the freedom, but also to avoid other people who can misuse your invention, because maybe they deal with your compounds under very low standards. They can run experiments that are not very well designed or conducted, and then, they destroy your asset once this is in public domain. So it's to raise the entry barrier for others. That's another reason for patenting.
Yeah, so I attended an IP workshop recently, and it's the misunderstanding of patents. So it's the misuse of patents, and that patents are not used to protect IP and to also recoup, and not always have to necessarily return on investment, but just to recoup the investment. Even the taxpayer funds academic drug discovery, right? I mean, there is still a bit of obligation towards taxpayers too. Then, I feel, I don't know whether that's the right topic, but there has been discontent about the way that natural compounds have been taken from third world countries or from worldwide countries and have just been developed as drugs, and there's no patent protection, and the originators really of the original natural compound medicine have not received anything, and now have to pay for the. So that's first not protection, but then of course also then the misuse of the patents in protecting then this property that was actually originated somewhere else. So I think this is such a complex topic. I think, and that's why these discussions are so important, because there's not a one right answer to anything. And I admire, and I think it's a bit like the environmental movement. It's so important to keep that flame alive and to make it a topic over and over again. Because if we stop making it a topic, then we end up like the hardware patent fights between Samsung and Apple and all that, and IBM, where it's just about protecting and fees, and the whole thing becomes like a hedge fund. This is not about IP protection anymore. So I appreciate all these discussions about the IP protection and open source, but it is a complex issue. Yeah.
I'm just quite interested to hear about, if you're doing all your open access all along, and I think it's brilliant what you're trying to do, what if somebody comes along and takes it from you?
Okay, the question is what happens if somebody comes along and takes what you've put in the public domain and uses it for their own benefit. So that's a win if that happens. You need to understand this, that the license for lots of open source things is such that you can take whatever you wish from an open source project and use it for your own purposes, including to make money, provided you cite the original. It's a Creative Commons license, which is often used in these things. So if somebody sees that you're doing something and sees a route to market and comes along and takes what you've done, that is fantastic. That would be an efficient way of taking something to market. And there's nothing to stop someone doing that. So it's meant to be an entirely inclusive process and meritocratic in the sense that whoever is best placed to capitalize on it will take it. So as an example, in Antiope prazoquantal thing that we did that was open source with WHO, we published it. You can cite it academically. I don't know who's using it for for a commercial benefit. I'm not told. There's no kickback yet. I know it's being taken to market. I think that one of the people taking to market is using the route that we used. But there's no need to ask for permission. It's an open source thing. So the mantra often with open source is you don't make money with open source. You make money using open source in the way that Samsung makes a lot of money by using the Android operating system. So yes, that's commercial exploitation by others is a very important part of the process.
So a question for Wes about, based on your experience on the malaria box and the number of requesters, you can already run some kind of statistics. I'm curious about whether or not you had to reject some of the requests, either because there's overlapping. You mentioned the merits and the value of overlapping, but I think that there is a limit for the number of people doing the same, because there's a limited amount of compound. And the other is about if you have been asked by the requester about exclusivity. I mean, is there anybody else doing running this kind of assays because they want to have some advantage at the end of the day they are investing as efforts or whatever, so maybe it's in publications or whatever they would like to have. How did you handle this for the malaria box, and how do you envisage for the pathogen box?
Right, great answers. So if you could bring that microphone down to Thomas, he can probably answer some of that, but I'll answer for him while he's coming down. We tried to get it done as many places as possible repetitively, so it was sent for schistosomiasis, as I said, 6 or 8 times, and for the same dang strain of HAT got run like 4 times and so on. And the data often came back different. So that was, depending on whether they looked at the turbidity or some light promoter or, whether they were wiggling or not at the end of the day. It's all very interesting to have it come back on an open source way like that and see how it compares. The only thing I think we refused often was when people would say, we want a malaria box because were going to run an in silico search against it, we would generally send them the smile strings and say, here you go, instead of actually sending them the box. And then very recently, we're down to our last 15 or 13 boxes. And so we're starting to tell people, you know, we need to reserve these for people that need to rerun some assays. And but I have had people ask me if people have run assays, and I've told them what I've told you, which is earlier when we had more boxes to distribute, that you probably will gain something out of redoing an assay per se in a different biological way. But we were able to tell people, yes, that had been done or not had been done. For the next etiology, what we decided, this is probably safe to say, is that people that never replied to about 40 emails from me saying, what did you do with the box, won't get a pathogen box. And that's about 25% of the people that got the box. So if you're out there and you haven't replied to me, you better do it tonight. But I would say all other comers are welcome. Do you want to add something to that, Thomas?
Yeah. It's very good way you said it. Maybe the malaria box is also used to kind of validate some platforms. So there's a reason sometimes to send more than, let's say, 3 copies for the same assay. So we just try to, for example, in endemic countries where they try to set up a lab, we send the malaria box just so they can, cross-check what they're doing. So that's the other utility of it.
I had a quick question about that. So given that the pathogen box is going to contain a lot of presumably very desirable compounds, then people may do their screen and then need more compound for follow-up. And you don't want to be a fountain of compounds the whole time. The CROs who are making some of these compounds, for example, are you thinking about making the chemical methodology available so that people can repeat the synthesis on a larger scale?
Yes.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Basically, the pathways will be available from the CROs that made them, and a lot of times, half the times, we were able to just buy 100 milligrams. So.
Sure, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Yes.
May I make a question about IP issue? I'm quite not familiar with IP issues, but in your presentation, you explained that you are very open philosophy. But how about just imagine that thousands of people make a contract with you, swearing that any IP should go to Matthew, and it's not the perfectly open project, but just the volunteers swearing that all IP should go to some open-minded person. Does it work?
Oh, so no, so there is no IP.
Because
there's no IP to give.
Yeah,
so you don't have that issue.
In my personal opinion, understanding, drug discovery is like gold mining a gold mine, and the owned by one person is acceptable, but it's stupid to find the gold mine by just a small number of people. So we should ask thousands of researchers to join. So I don't know how to do that, but to make such a group worldwide.
I wish we could go into the hills and dig up drugs. That would be fantastic. Simple as that. It's pan the rivers. I don't know. I'm not sure the answer. I'm not sure what you're asking. Actually, sorry. I think that this is one of the reasons why the IP issue tries to be very clear in this project, is because we don't want to have these issues of anyone thinking that someone owns something when there is nothing there. It's very important to have that. Otherwise, you get these arguments and people start getting them. It's also intended to be simple in terms of contractual obligation. So we try to minimize the paperwork in the sense that if someone does something for an open source project, they can then walk away afterwards. And there's no indemnity clauses, for example, so you don't worry about people doing things wrongly. It's meant to be a light touch. So it's a very nimble team. People do one thing and then they stop and they will not have anything else to do with the project, or they'll come back in 6 months' time. It's extremely fluid, which makes it very difficult to define who the author list is on papers, but it's a small price to pay. Another question?
Thank you. This one's directed to Dr. Match, Wu Ji. Now, China doesn't exactly have a very good history when it comes to QA and QC in pharmaceutical industry and adulteration of milk and so on and so forth. How much is the regulatory controls being tightened in China to ensure that the products you are producing are of sufficiently high quality?
Okay, that's a pretty big question, as I'm sure you recognise. So the Chinese CFDA is gradually aligning itself with its practices with the FDA and the EMEA. And it's having to do that because the CRO industry that I described in terms of its sheer scope relies on generating data that can be used on a worldwide platform. Our own company generates toxicology and manufacturing data for products that are used worldwide, and they are, in many cases, inspected by the worldwide regulators. So, there's a difference between an international CRO serving the multinational corporations and small companies to exactly the same way, and local companies that are perhaps have a track record of previous exposure to a CFDA that had a much more lackluster approach to regulations. So I think it's fair to say, it is a problem. It continues to be a problem, but it is much less of a problem, and it's a vanishingly small problem for companies of the size of Wuji that work on an international stage.
Didn't mean you.
No, I realise that.
Were there any questions about the work on ontologies that people had and are afraid to ask? Because I had one about that, and the question I had was, in defining things like ontologies, they're incredibly complicated. How important is it that you are able to have the community input to this, as opposed to it just being a unilateral project?
Yeah.
How important is this community element?
It's the most important thing. This is one of the most important things. Because of that, they are open in order to be reused as much as possible and to be implemented and keep updated as long as knowledge improves or changes also. Right. So they are traceable and annotated also with timestamps. So an entity, I will not call it concepts because there is a kind of there are two philosophies to build ontologies. One is concept-oriented, so whoever scientist can describe the concept in his mind and is not obliged in reference and define and explain what he puts in the ontology. It can be used. And there is the other way, which is followed by the Obo Foundry, where everything should be defined, explained, referenced, and built according to some shared principles. So if other experts in the domain find that there is some misleading entity with a wrong definition or whatever, they can submit. Or they can change autonomously, of course, the ontology because they download, and then they can add their authorship to the same entity. Right. So in the same, let's say, old file, we can have 3 authors for the same entity, and if there is some agreement, the same authors share the same definition. If there is no, then there is a debate, and at the end, even the IDO extension is done with a top-level surveillance about the final result. So the OBO is peer-reviewed. This is a requirement for OBO Foundry ontologies. Sure. And for example, I was wondering if for phenotyping, are you thinking about using ontologies for classifying phenotypes? Because there is the Monarch project built to foster bioinformatics analysis, connected genes with phenotypes also. So I was wondering
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we're spending a lot of time at the moment, trying to find the best way of interpreting that data. So the tools that were discussed today are the kind of tools that we're looking at using. So I think it's it's a very valuable additional resource that we can use.
One more topic, if you don't mind.
Great.
So there was a lot of press in the past few years about pre-competitive data sharing. So you're obviously on the far right end of sharing everything all the time, but Barbara's platform is a great one for pre-competitive sharing and so on. I wonder if Barbara has any comments about whether she's seeing that more happening in the pharmaceutical industry or even in the neglected disease space. I think Rob Don gave a beautiful example of where they mined 100 compounds from 5 or 6 different companies, did iterative screening, pre-competitively shared that back, were able to do refinement and really speed up the process. But is that happening, or is it mostly just lip service?
Well, it's a European lead factory. That's one of the leading projects on that front. And the buzzword is the honest data broker there, as far as I understand, so that nobody sees all the data. I think there are still some questions which I don't quite understand, because a database is still a database, right? So there is somebody probably has access. So compliance is and in my opinion, it boils down to compliance often with pre-competitive data sharing. So you have to have strict rules. You have to have the technology to lock data down and to not make it visible to someone else. We do have a project also where you can try to de-orphan a compound by running it against a set of other compounds that you don't actually ever know what the structure is, because you obfuscate some fingerprints. So it's interesting projects, but they're very early stages. So whether that really works and whether the results that come back are true remains to be seen. And that is all run in neglected diseases. European lead factory is slightly different. I'm not involved with that, so I don't really. I've only heard talks about it. But you pool compounds and then you give them out to screening and you share the knowledge and you see just some of it. The IP question is there's also a really interesting one. The way they handle it, that's probably one of the biggest hurdles in it, because pharmaceutical companies are involved in those. But so I think neglected disease area is spearheading this big time. As far as I can, I mean, my sense. I could be wrong, and people in pharma will probably correct me, but I wouldn't be surprised if in 10 years' time there's a lot of that going on for normal drug discovery. I wouldn't be surprised, because to me it smells of that as if that's what's coming, with the outsourcing, with the virtualization of pharmaceutical drug discovery, etc. But right now it's being shaped. So all these open source projects, etc., are probably very important right now, because they will pave the way for new approaches to this that people didn't think were possible. I sometimes compare it with the German car makers. German car makers don't build the cars. They build the cars, they put them together. But all the technology that's inside the car comes from other companies. And they just make sure it's assembled correctly and they put the right badge on it. And they trust their suppliers and they work with their suppliers, and suppliers do all the R&D. And Volkswagen has got a chemistry department and a material science department. Japan is amazing. Toyota does everything, not because they want to build it, but because they want to control their suppliers. So that's kind of what I can see slowly coming here with pharma. That pharma will retain knowledge, has to retain knowledge, but academia, biotechs, all these MMBs, DNDIs will be the innovation drivers that then pharma will tap into. And I think that's when the pre-competitive data sharing will really take off, and the open source projects hopefully will then see how fruitful these projects are.
Yeah, sounds like putting cars together with things from other. It's just like chemistry. We don't make the atoms; they come from exploding stars. We just put them in the right order. It's the same deal. We had the same thing as Alan just mentioned about the honest data broker. In our case, was also MMV. That we said that we were going to go after a certain series, and they said you might not want to do that because somebody else is doing it. There's a great value there, because without disclosing everyone's details, you can still reduce duplication. So there is great value to that. Yeah, and I think there'll always be that in the absence of a completely open situation. Okay, well, maybe it's beer o'clock. I think maybe that's. But I don't want to get in the way of everybody. I think it's a really fascinating session, bringing up lots of very interesting issues, and hopefully this evening and tomorrow we will also be able to talk about some of these things. We're not going to solve any of these things because we're dealing with extremely complicated issues, but I'm sure we'll move the debate on. So thank you everybody for very stimulating presentations. Thank you to the audience for all that.